It's 2019. So many things that we do involve electronics and the use of the internet. Yet just over 30 years ago, there weren't any smartphones, and there was no internet, and there was no HTML. What is HTML, you ask? Well, without the creation of HTML, the World Wide Web as we know it today would not exist. That's why we are going to take a look at what HTML is, as well as its history and evolution over the past 30 years. We can attribute the invention of HTML and of the World Wide Web itself to a man by the name of Tim Berners-Lee, known now as Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Sir Tim Berners-Lee is an English scientist and academic who was born on June 8, 1955, and graduated from Oxford University. Before we take a look at the evolution of Berners-Lee's revolutionary HTML, let's discuss what HTML is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Breaking that down further, hypertext is text that links to other information and is now usually associated with web pages. This technology has actually been around since the 1960s. The other half of HTML is markup language, which is simply a computer language that uses tags to define elements within a document, using standard words as opposed to programming syntax. Now back to Sir Berners-Lee and his HTML. While working at CERN, CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, Berners-Lee became frustrated that he had to log on to different computers in order to access different information stored on each one. He thought that there had to be an easier way of accessing the information that is on one computer from another one that you were using. And so between 1991 and 1992, while working on his first browser editor for the web, Berners-Lee came up with a hypertext language called HTML that would more easily allow people to publish and exchange scientific and other technical documents. This HTML was based off of a system of screens, keyboards, buttons, and levers that was described in an article titled As We May Think in the Atlantic Monthly in 1945, written by Vannevar Bush, who was an engineer born at the end of the 19th century. The system's purpose was to store and retrieve information via microfilm, and Bush called the links between numerous pieces of information associative trails. Similarly, Berners-Lee's HTML incorporated the ability to link the documents electronically using hyperlinks, thus the name Hypertext Markup Language. More specifically, Berners-Lee's HTML is used to define the structure and layout of a page, how the page looks, and any specific functions it has. It consists of elements, and those elements are represented by tags, which we will discuss more in depth later. In turn, those tags are read by web browsers. In the case of his original version of HTML, the NEXT Next Navigator browser, to know how to display the content. There were only a few tags in his original version, 22 to be exact, and it was completely text-based, meaning that no images or videos could be inserted using it. Because of this, and because of the use of standard words instead of programming syntax, people wouldn't have to know a lot about the standard type of markup language, SGML, that is, at that time, to be able to learn and use his HTML. It was simplistic, so simplistic in fact that it was said that it could be mastered in an afternoon. Sir Tim Berners-Lee's first version of HTML was published in June of 1993, following his creation of the HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol that is, and the World Wide Web in 1989. However, at the time of the release of HTML version 1, not a lot of people were involved in creating websites, so the language didn't grow a lot. Following all of that, Berners-Lee founded the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C as I'll refer to it from now on, at MIT LCS in collaboration with CERN in October of 1994. The purpose of the organization was to standardize HTML and keep it evolving in the right direction. The W3C created and published as recommendations versions 1 through 4 of HTML in the 90s, which we will discuss more in depth here shortly. Elements have been removed and added in each version of HTML since its original introduction in 1993, and version 1 of HTML included tags such as A, LI for list, UL for unordered list, and title, which are some of the tags that are still present in the current version of HTML. Skip a few years and we come to September of 1995 when W3C released HTML 2.0. This was their first version officially published as a recommendation, meaning that it went through a process at W3C designed to promote consensus, fairness, public accountability, and quality before it would be publicly released and known as a web standard. This version of HTML included new tags such as image, link, meta, head, and HTML, all of which are present in today's version. HTML 2.0 was the standard for website design until January of 1997. Around this time, though, trouble was brewing. More and more people were starting to use HTML and wanting more abilities and tags. Due to this, Netscape, who was the leader in the browser market at the time, developed their own proprietary tags and attributes and put them in their browser, Netscape Navigator. This caused problems as other browser creators tried to replicate the effects of Netscape's tags but couldn't get their browsers to display things the same way as Netscape Navigator did. This was the reason for the release of HTML 3.0. This version included many new and improved abilities from the last one. However, browsers were slow to implement these new features, and HTML 3.0 was cast aside. It was then decided to design future improvements to be modular so that they could be added in stages as opposed to in one large chunk, which would make it easier for web browsers to adapt to the new changes. Since proprietary tags kept appearing, a standard for HTML was needed. This standard turned out to be HTML 3.2, which was a toned down version of the existing standards and left a lot of the big steps for later versions, demonstrating the decision W3C made after the failure of HTML 3.0. HTML 3.2 was the first formally approved industry-wide HTML standard and was published as a recommendation by W3C on December 18, 1997. The new tags and attributes added to HTML 3.2 included div, center, style, and sub, all of which are still in use today. This was the standard up until December of 1997, when W3C published as a recommendation HTML 4.0. This was a huge step in the evolution of HTML, and this version was quite different than HTML 3.0. It brought with it the support for cascading style sheets, CSS for short, which was HTML's new supporting presentational language. Styling tags and attributes that had been used in HTML 3.2 were deprecated, and web page developers no longer had to search a bunch of different HTML pages to manually code the styles of things such as texts and links, as they could now do it in one single style sheet. Therefore, styling became much easier to work with when it was separated from HTML. HTML 4.0 also introduced new tags such as frame, no script, span, and no frames, as well as more complex tables, more complex forms, and improved accessibility features for people with disabilities. This version of HTML became the official standard in April of 1998. A year and a half later, in December of 1999, W3C released HTML 4.01. It was a slightly improved version of 4.0, and it included several changes to the specification. It contained some corrections to errors in the HTML 4.0 specification, and the addition of some new attributes, as well as new usability functionality and a new document type definition, DDT, if you will, called strict, that allows no use of deprecated tags and attributes. Just over a month later, in January of 2000, W3C released as a joint standard with HTML 4.01 something called XHTML 1.0. This was a whole new branch of HTML that incorporated the aspects of XML, meaning the code must be written properly in order for it to work once it reaches the user's browser. However, XHTML is not a completely different language from HTML, rather it is an advancement of it and has a larger focus on adherence to standards in semantic code. This in turn allowed it to be a stricter, cleaner, and more efficient version of HTML. HTML 4.01 and XHTML 1.0 were the last versions of HTML published for about 8 years. The people at W3C got sidetracked working on a new proposal for XHTML2, but the path of that specification ended up looking unrealistic. So, in 2007, W3C decided to scrap the XHTML and pour their efforts into the HTML5 specification instead. Also in that group of time, a group of people outside of W3C that included web technology fans, browser programmers, and specification writers started building something of their own. They had the goal to reflect the modern dynamic web while keeping backwards compatibility with existing HTML code specifications. Forming in 2004, this group called themselves the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group, WHATWG, WHATWIG for short, is all I like to say. Between then and 2006, WHATWG gained support from major web browser developers. They released their first public draft of HTML5 in 2008. WHATWG and W3C actually worked together for years on HTML5, but split their efforts in 2011 because they had different goals. W3C wanted to publish a finished version of HTML5, while WHATWG wanted to work on a living standard for HTML, where they would continuously update and maintain the specification, and functionality could not be removed. Since then, WHATWG has been working on the HTML5 specification, and W3C has copied those fixes made by WHATWG into their own version of the specification. WHATWG published their HTML5 living standard in 2012, while W3C released their HTML5 recommendation on October 28, 2014. In 2016, W3C released their HTML 5.1 recommendation, with their HTML 5.1 second edition recommendation coming in October 2017, followed by their HTML 5.2 recommendation in December of that year. I will continue to refer to all versions of this HTML standard as just HTML5 though. Many tags and attributes have been added to HTML5, including new semantic or structural elements such as footer, header, nav, and main, new form elements such as data list and output, and new HTML graphics elements such as canvas and SVG. It also includes media elements such as audio, video, embed, and source. HTML5 has come to represent two different concepts: the new version of the HTML markup language, as I just discussed, as well as a larger set of technologies that allow the building of more diverse and powerful websites and applications, the latter sometimes being called HTML5 and Friends. And nowadays, with it being the latest web standard, everything from huge corporate sites to student web projects use HTML5.